welcome back to Exodus Brothers. Today we're sitting down with someone whose journey out of evangelical Christianity is as honest and hard-earned as any we've heard. Our guest is Annie Mesaros, who holds a Master of Divinity and is a self-described emotional support witch. A survivor of spiritual abuse in the Christian church, Annie founded Wild Maven Wellness, where she now helps others find beauty and magic in spirituality outside of organized religion.
Annie went through what she describes as a dark night of the soul in her early 20s. That moment launched a decade-long unraveling of her old beliefs and a slow rebuilding of something new.
Today we're going to talk about that journey, the collapse, the anger, the reconstruction, and the person she became on the other side. Annie, we're so glad you're here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Same. Annie, can you just paint a picture of the environment you grew up in? What were, the core beliefs that shaped your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Edmonds, Washington, which is a suburb of Seattle. And we actually commuted into the city for church multiple times a week. We went to University Presbyterian Church, usually once or twice on Sundays and Wednesday evenings for various programming and youth group growing up. My parents were always super involved. They actually met there. So even when we moved out of the city and into a life of suburbia, we stayed connected there. And we're very active members. My parents always had leadership roles. And avid attender of Sunday school and youth group. There was a really strong emphasis on God loves you. But then there was also this competing emphasis on don't fuck it up. It was a very confusing set of messages that now I'm why were we even trying to reconcile that? That doesn't make any sense. But it was something that I always felt like I was striving to maintain God's love for me.
Mm-hmm. Growing up with that kind of fear and that kind of mistrust and stuff, fear of yourself or fear of getting things wrong, how did that form in your home and your church environment?
Yeah, I think, I've come to realize as an adult that my parents were having a very different experience than I was, where they had started attending there under a different pastor who was very love forward. The main thing he wanted to communicate to people was Jesus loves you. And then he left and a new pastor came in and he was much more academic. When I got to seminary and got to read an actual diverse set of theologians and biblical scholars, I was looking back on my pastor's teaching growing up, it felt like if you had asked him hey, what do any women of color say about this? Or have you read any African theologians or Latin American theologians? He'd be why? Who cares? We already have our trinity of these guys that I like to reference. And so it just felt very heady, very patriarchal, but kind of cloaked in this weird kind of sense of liberalism that it was an academic community. It's University Presbyterian Church in Seattle. It's right next to the University of Washington. A lot of crossover with the university community. I think my parents were having this experience of we started going here because of Bruce and now all our friends are here and we can have these great programs for our kids. They didn't know that the purity movement was going on. They just trusted, I think, that our leaders were also teaching God loves you. And I recently talked on another podcast about how my mom and our family friend Jan were our fourth grade Sunday school teachers. And that's the year that we got our first Bible, and so heavy on Jesus loves you. But kind of after that, it just felt like this turning point once you got into adolescence of hey, if you get sexually aroused, God will forgive you, but your soul will be broken. So just be careful. What are you supposed to do with that?
And that seems kind of typical in evangelical circles or in a lot of Protestant churches, is this idea that it's not just a religion, it's about having a relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of started describing it as I was coming out of it as I don't think I ever doubted that Jesus loved me or that God loved me. I just didn't really have a sense that God liked me. And I kind of think that's a shame now. Now it's not really a concern that I have. It's not really how my spirituality is oriented. But yeah, it really sucked at the time and really trying to please God, but then also being told that's not what God wants from you. So it's a lot of being pulled in different directions for sure.
And what was a lot of the messaging that was that you were getting as a girl in the church?
Yeah, a lot of it was well, boys can't control themselves. So they're having other secret conversations that we weren't privy to, that boys will just struggle, and that girls need to just have really, really firm boundaries. Basically, like put any protections in place, like on behalf of the two of you. You know, if you're dating someone or interested in someone or hanging out with someone, you have to make sure that you're either holding this person at arm's length or being in a public place or saying no. I remember every year that we would go to camp, at some point, inevitably, they would put all the girls in a room together, and a female counselor would get up and say, I had sex with my boyfriend, and it's the biggest regret I've ever had in my life. And I'm just so grateful that God would forgive me, but please don't make the mistakes that I did. It was so horrible, and I'm so filled with shame, and I don't want you to be filled with this shame, so just don't do what I did. And that felt like a pretty consistent like testimony that was put before us.
Right, like a lot of shame around it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So can we jump to, I think, age 21? Can you describe the moment you realized something was shifting inside you?
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that happened like over, I would say there was shifting happening for many years. But when I was 21, I went through an experience that now I know is called the dark night of the soul. And it's the experience of the absence of God. I had been told forever, God will never leave you. God is always present with you, available to you. And that's where it's so interesting when I had this experience of the dark night of the soul, where like it just felt like a spiritual vacuum or like an energetic vacuum. Like God was just gone. And I don't think I noticed it at first. And so then when I did, it was, you know, like when you have your daily quiet time or you go to church or whatever it is, it's like sometimes you feel a little bit more engaged and sometimes you feel a little less engaged. But then I was like, I don't feel like I've really like felt God in a while. And then I was like, well, I'll do better. And I was like, oh, he's still not here.
I think that's where a lot of self-gaslighting comes in, because when you don't hear God and you do feel that emptiness and you're told, well, you're just not praying hard enough, you're not reading your Bible enough, you need to just go and pray harder. And then people are like just exhausting themselves to the point where they're praying for hours and they're trying to search for God and they're not hearing anything. And then it feels like they're doing something wrong. What am I doing wrong? It must be me. It must be a me problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so it just like, once I started noticing it and then couldn't fix it, that's when it got really scary. And it was just this like, well, God doesn't do that. So that's on you, you know, like whether that's praying harder, worshiping harder at church, reading the Bible more, like, well, you must have done something or you must be missing something or you must just not be hearing God because God wouldn't just leave you. And so I do define or often like describe spiritual abuse as this kind of like intense gaslighting, because spirituality is our own experience of the divine. But then for somebody else to come in and say, like, that's not the experience that you're having, or you're wrong about that experience, is a total mindfuck. And that's really what was going on for me. It lasted, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was around 6 months. And everybody I told was just like, yeah, I don't think God does that. So, okay. Or they didn't understand. Like, I didn't really have language for it. It was very difficult to describe and very difficult to experience. And finally, actually, I think what helped, it, you know, it kind of like faded back in as much as it had faded out, like this sense of like connection with like a spiritual something. But part of what I think helped it end was having some language for it. And my friend Liz was attending Gonzaga University in Spokane, and it's a Jesuit university. And she was learning about St. John of the Cross, who coined the term the dark night of the soul in the 1400s in Spain. And she like photocopied a reading that they had done for class and mailed it to me. And she was like, hey, I know that you've really been struggling, and I know that you've really been struggling to define or articulate what it is that you're experiencing, but this sounded familiar to me. Like, is this at all what you're experiencing? And it was. And really, like, the theological teaching from St. John of the Cross, also his friend Teresa of Avila, and many others since then, is that it's not necessarily the absence of God. It's that the channels that we use, whether that's reading your Bible, corporate worship, communion, anything like that, where we're used to accessing God, we're shut off from those. And that kind of the theological or like spiritual practice purpose of this is that then the only place to find God beyond that is like within your own self and in your own heart. And so that very much goes against all of the theology that I was taught, which first of all, is this like finding God through external means, but then also that your own intuition, your own inner voice of wisdom can only lead you astray is very untrustworthy, super dangerous. But that was my experience, that I had this deep inner knowing that I was created on purpose and I was created for a purpose. And at that point in time, I just was like, well, that's all I know. I don't know where that came from. I didn't hear a voice or anything. I just like, that's what I had, this like sense of knowing of like these two specific phrases of like, you were created on purpose and you were created for a purpose. And that was so freeing. It was relieving to have any kind of like sense of connection to anything outside of myself, but also that I had found it like within myself was like, oh, well, this is different and this is better.
Yeah, that's powerful.
It is, yeah. And can you, just for listeners who don't know what dark night of the soul means, can you just describe that like just really briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the experience of the absence of God. And it functionally, in terms of like spiritual practice, means that whatever practices you've had no longer serve whatever purpose they serve. So if it's like you feel a sense of like connectedness, or like people experience that in different ways, right? Like it might be like your heart feels really full. You might feel like physical sensations. You might feel a sense of peace or calm. Whatever, however you experience your spirituality, that the practices have kind of gone dry, essentially, which then forces you into new and different practices and experiences.
Following this dark night of the soul, what did your deconstruction look like those first couple of years?
It was really, really messy because at that point, then I was like, well, these people don't know what the fuck they're talking about, right? Like, of course God can leave you. I just had this whole experience and they still don't believe me. And so at the same time, it coincided with a lot of other changes in my life. I was living out of state, attending college. That had been very revealing in itself of like, oh, I thought I was conservative coming from a conservative church in liberal Seattle, but then going to Orange County, like nobody told me it was going to be super conservative. A lot of the Christians I made friends with didn't even believe that women could be pastors. And I was like, why?
A lot more fundamentalist.
Yeah. And just like, and I was going to a non-denominational church, which in my experience, they try to take the Bible a lot more literally. I, of course, came from a Presbyterian church that was very much into, that, like I said, the intellectual side of it. So taking a much more academic approach to the Bible, not literal interpretations at all, treating it as a historical text. And then the church I was going to in California was like, oh, elders have to be married men because it says in whatever First Timothy that elders are like a husband of one wife. And I was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, it says it right there. It's like, but those aren't the only people qualified to lead. And they were like, yes, they are. And I just was like, okay, this is crazy town. So that was already, different perspectives, exposure to different things, including also the church I grew up in, very anti-gay in every sense. But then I made gay friends in college, and they weren't necessarily Christians, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't think anyone who was out at the time was also Christian. And I just, like that was really good exposure for me. My brother is also gay, but that was something I'd had such a hard time accepting for many years. But I was just kind of changing and growing. And so the Dark Night was one aspect of that, of just, lots of things change when you leave home for the first time and start to explore and kind of compare yourself to the new people that you're meeting. Yeah, I became a big advocate for LGBTQ inclusion in the church because I was like, it's all of the theology and doctrine that I had been offered was now on the table to be disputed because like they had basically like invalidated everything they had taught me. And so I had like a much bigger sense of openness. And I think my deconstruction was really a process of disillusionment with the church itself, where I went back there as an adult and I actually started working at that church And that was a very wild experience where I was both working there and then as a member, I was advocating for like the humane treatment and dignity and respect of LGBTQ people, including marriage and ordination, which was a huge topic of, I'm sure it still is in churches, but within the Presbyterian Church USA, which that congregation is a part of. That was a very active conversation at the time. And I was like, great, finally, we can talk about it. This was never even mentioned when I was growing up. So yeah, let's really hash this out. And let me tell you about this experience that I had where I experienced the absence of God and I learned so much. And now I'm like so willing to just be like, hey, maybe God does love gay people. You told us that we were created, in God's image. And then when people come out, you're like, oh, but not you. Like, what the hell? Like, this is like hypocritical and harmful and unkind. And you say we're a family, so let's just do this. And yeah, that didn't go very well.
How did your parents deal with your brother coming out?
It was a very many year process. They knew before I did. And he had a lot of very harmful experiences in the church and like church adjacent ministries. And so, kind of what it came to was like by the time I was willing to be a vocal advocate, he had long since left the church. My parents were still there where I was an employee, they were still members, elders. And by the time I was a vocal advocate, they were ready as well, where they had not been up until that point. And I think he'd been out to me at that point for probably like 8 years. I would say 8 to 10 years. Yeah, it was hard. It was just a series of really hard realizations. And I will also say I have failed to talk about this in recent interviews. So I think I should mention my parents and I did start an advocacy group within the church where I was kind of like collecting a few different people of like friends that I had gone to youth group with, like they had come out. I kind of had my eye on their parents, a couple other folks, mostly like actually in my parents' generation. And then actually a gay couple who they were going to church with me at like a smaller, like offshoot church, a church plant in South Lake Union. But one half of that couple had been active at UPC at this bigger church for many decades. And so I kind of had this awareness of a few folks. And so we got together for, I think, just like coffee one night or dessert at my friend Lori's house. And we were like, let's do this. Like, let's be in an advocacy group. And we met monthly for a long time. Last I heard, they were still meeting. I left in 2013. I just couldn't do it anymore. I left my job. I revoked my membership of the church. I still was attending this other smaller church plant for a couple of years after that, but I just got too angry. And pretty soon after I left, my parents left also, and they attend a different Presbyterian church now.
At some point, you left and went to seminary and got a Master of Divinity.
Mm-hmm.
So what prompted that, and what were you hoping to find there?
I went and I did that as soon as I left that job, actually. I left the job in September and I enrolled in seminary in January because I was just like, what are we doing? Like, this is so, I was still a Christian at the time. And I just was like, can you see yourselves? Can you hear yourselves? Like, the hypocrisy is so loud. The logic just isn't there. We were in this like staff kind of like brown bag theology lunch thing with the senior pastor, who then was a different senior pastor than I had grown up with. And he is like my arch nemesis. He actually just left there this summer. George Hinman. Yeah, he was like, well, we'll have a brown bag lunch and I'll like answer everyone's questions. And it's like, I mean, you can tell us what you believe. That's answering our question, I guess. But like, we don't really have a question. It's up like, what do you think you're doing? And so there were people on staff who also kind of were in my camp and wanting to advocate for these changes and more inclusion. And someone said, like, how on earth can this church support remarriage after divorce, which Jesus specifically preaches against or teaches against? And yet you cannot entertain the idea of officiating gay marriages, weddings, or ordaining gay people. And when Jesus never once mentioned anything about it. And he was like, well, that's complicated. Like, the divorce thing is complicated. I was like, no, people in power in this community got divorced and wanted to get remarried, and suddenly that was okay. And now that's the norm in this community. Like, that's all that happened. I'm sure at one point it wasn't okay, but in the 100-year history of this community, it became okay because someone wanted to make it okay. That's all it is.
Hmm. A lot of times, I think people actually follow the theology of Paul more than they do the theology of Jesus. It's more like Paulianity.
Yes.
And I'm so over Paul. And he also didn't write a lot of the letters that are attributed to him, which I'm sure the two of you know with all the studying that you've done. But
Yes. Yep.
it's just like, why can't we just choose how we treat each other? Well, actually, I will say we do choose how we treat each other. Why don't we just stop hiding behind religion?
Yeah. Spending time in seminary, I've heard various statistics that up to even a third of people who attend seminary actually have a crisis of faith, or even a large percentage of those that actually deconstruct or become agnostic or atheist,
Mm-hmm.
which is why the joke, it's called the cemetery because it's where your beliefs go to die.
Oh,
So
that's good.
do you feel like when you learned more about the theology and the things that mainstream scholars were saying, and did that change a lot of your beliefs?
It's an interesting question. And actually, to answer your earlier question, I went because I was like, this church is like extremely fucked up, and I believe that we can do better. And I didn't mean that in the way of like, I'm going to become a pastor and start a church that's better than this. I never had any intention of becoming a pastor, but I believe I've always been a theologian because I grew up just asking a lot of questions and kind of fussing with different ideas and being curious. And I remember one time like asking my mom, like, well, if we're God's children and Jesus is God's son, like, is Jesus like our brother? And she was like, I don't think so. I don't know. Like these just different things that like pop into your head when you're a kid and you're like, how do these things fit together? I don't think she was like bothered by it or offended. I think she just was like, how should I know? I just was always really curious. And I would like lead Bible studies a lot for my friends and like plan little retreats for us and things like that. So I just wanted to keep doing that. And I wanted to keep doing LGBTQ advocacy in the church. So I wanted to both improve like my pastoral counseling skills for working directly with queer folks, but then also really hone like my theological skills so that I could continue to engage with institutions, either like supporting them in their change or challenging them. The changes that I went through, I would say that I was still a Christian when I graduated, but I believe by then I had stopped attending church. And it really was like I had an in-between phase where I kept calling myself a progressive Christian because it was just kind of like a fuck you to the men who had like driven me out of the church, that like they don't get to define my beliefs. I'm the only one who gets to define my beliefs. And even if I'm not Christian enough for them, I'm Christian enough for me. And that's really between me and God. And I will also say, at this point in time, I don't believe in like a personified God as like a single deific being, but I absolutely am like deeply spiritual. I will say that I believe in God as like a shorthand for believing in like the higher powers that may be that I experience through spirituality because of the dark night of the soul. Like you can't experience the absence of something that was never there. Yeah, it just was like there were a few years where I was like, well, I'm just a really progressive Christian. And then it got to a point where I was like, I don't need any of it. Like, I don't need Jesus to be divine. I think he's a great guy. I think he thinks I'm great, but I don't need him to be divine. I don't need the Bible for anything in particular at this point. It's not like a source of guidance for me anymore. And I don't want it to be. Not that I don't think it's like not full of like great, juicy insight into humanity.
But also those things exist outside of the Bible and have existed prior to the Bible.
Totally. One of the best things that like actually clicked for me in my very first semester of seminary, I was taking class on Sabbath. And so we went to a Jewish synagogue in town on like a little field trip and talked to a rabbi about his experience of the Sabbath, which was funny because as you all know, having parents who are in ministry, like clergy don't rest on the Sabbath, they work on the Sabbath and like they're busy leading. And organizing services and all of that. So that was true for this rabbi too. He was like, gosh, Sabbath, yeah, I'm leading a lot of services. Then I have dinner with my family. But he said that for him, and I can't remember which tradition within Judaism he's in, but he was like, the Bible is a collection of one people's experience of the divine. at one time, actually over like a huge period of time. But, you know, like they stopped adding to the canon at one point in time. And he was like, and it doesn't need to be anything else. That in itself is a gift. If you love humanity and you care about what humans care about, that's enough. That like you can take this book and be like, wow, this is an incredible story of like humanity and like what their fears are, what their hopes are, who they love, what they want, what they feel like they need to survive. And it really clicked for me because I was like, I think that's how I already feel. I just didn't have the language for it. And that was the very beginning of seminary. And so that was super helpful. And then I actually said that to a Christian friend of mine a little while later. And he was like, oh, that just breaks my heart. That's so sad. And I was like, oh, I was telling you because I was like, Matt, guess what cool thing I heard at school? He was like, but it's God's word for us. And I was like, okay, well, let's move on to another part of the conversation then, because that's not really where I'm at. And so, yeah, I believe whatever statistics you've heard about people having a crisis of faith in seminary, I believe are true. And also people leaving Christianity altogether, whatever their beliefs ultimately end up being, I think is probably true. And I would also say, I think that if you're going to go and like truly grapple with theology, with doctrine, and with the biblical text, you should have a crisis. Whether, I mean, you can still be a Christian after that, but it should be deeply challenging if you're really doing the work.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the people that are more fundamentalist or evangelical that think that it's perfect, it's the inerrant word of God, and then they get down and they start studying like Hebrew and the Masoretic texts and things like that, and they say, oh, this, when they said the word pierced here, that's actually not what the original Hebrew text is saying. It's using perfect tense in the past. It's not referring to a future Messiah, messianic prophecy. So this is about the nation of Israel. And so you start learning these things that are accepted by mainstream scholars. These are not fringe ideas, except for when you get to evangelical or super fundamentalist churches that preach that this is all literal and it's all infallible. There are no contradictions. And then you find contradictions. Like, that doesn't mean you have to lose your faith. You just have to like acknowledge them and be honest with the actual text.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important. And what I think we don't get sometimes in certain Christian traditions, whether that's in the church or in certain seminaries, is the difference between like studying the biblical text and like the doctrine that you read into it and the biases that we bring in, because it's like taught a certain way because they're actually being taught doctrine, which is like what your community has decided their set of beliefs is, not what the text actually says. It's a particular interpretation of the text. And I had an incredible Hebrew professor in seminary, J.P. Kong, who's, as far as I know, he's still a part-time pastor and then part-time professor, and just like a really incredible scholar and human being and a very patient professor. What a big problem was at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology is, as an MDiv student, they don't actually offer the MDiv anymore. They have a number of Masters of Arts in Theology, which is a different degree. But the challenging thing was, you know, you take these like core classes of like 100 people and 80% of them are counseling students and they're learning to be therapists. Then you get a lot of students in the classroom who are like, well, I wasn't here to have a crisis of faith. I was here because I want to be a Christian therapist, but I have to take this Bible class. And now you're telling me that like Ruth isn't really a real person. And that makes me really angry. And I'm going to talk about it. And then we have like the one table of MDiv students and we're like, Jesus, can we just learn what we were supposed to learn today and not take care of this person's emotions around having, you know, like, well, my pastor told me something different. And, you know, JP handled it beautifully, but it also was a big frustration in how the program was set up. Because it's like, can we have a class just for us, please? Where we're like, we get it and we want to learn. Yeah, it just was just fascinating.
Yeah. So I was just curious, so after this whole process, how did people start responding to you in the community and in church and in seminary as you started to pull away? And did you feel grief, anger? What were you feeling and what was going on there?
I think what kept me calling myself a Christian and going to church as long as I did was that it was such a core part of my identity. And I was like, well, if I'm not this, then what am I? And it just took a long time to be like, now I'm like, I'm so not Christian that it just feels kind of empty to say that I am. So I'll stop without having like a clear next step. I can't remember exactly why I stopped going to church. I think just because it felt more like an obligation and I wasn't going that much anyway. And I had been pretty connected. So, like I mentioned, I grew up going to University Presbyterian Church. And even while I was working there, I was primarily engaged with a church plant of theirs, Union Church in South Lake Union, which is now a separate church. And I had been pretty engaged there for like 10 years and really close with the pastors. One of my best friends is someone that I met there. Now we're both witches, and like we actually led a retreat together at my parents' church, like a witchy meditation retreat last summer. And we were like, oh, this is kind of full circle for us. We met in a Presbyterian church, and now here we are having like a witchy meditation yoga retreat and renting my parents' church. I can't remember exactly why I decided to leave the church, except that I think it just kind of felt like a chore or an obligation to go. But I remember having lunch with my pastor, and I really wanted her permission to leave. Like I wanted her blessing. And she gave it to me like so freely and so easily because she's amazing. And she was never going to be like, oh no, I'm worried about your soul. Like if you don't come to church, she just was like a really loving person who wants the best for me. And she took my word for it that it wasn't the place for me. And then I also was like, damn it, Renee, like fight for me. But also thank you because I'm leaving. And so that was it was good to have like a marked ending and not just kind of like fade into the background. I think I needed that.
After this, what did your spirituality look like for you? And what surprised you, I guess, the most about life after Christianity?
I think what surprises me most is how happy I am. Yeah. I never thought it was important before. I remember working with a coach a long time ago, around the time I was turning 30. She was like, something about like being happy. And I was like, who said anything about being happy? Like, that's not the goal. The goal is to like, do something that's meaningful or help other people or make the world a better place, which are all things that I still want to do. And she was like, you don't want to be happy? I was like, no, because I'm not like a wimp. Like I want to work hard and change the world. And she just was like, I think it's also okay to be happy and also do meaningful work in the world. She seemed very confused by my response, and I was very confused by her line of questioning. So we were in like a little bit of a stalemate for a minute. But yeah, it kind of makes me think I should reach out to her and be like, by the way, I'm happy now and I get what you mean. I'm much, much happier because I very rarely get caught up in like what I should do in terms of like practices and things like that to live a good life. I mostly just check in with myself in the moment and think of like, okay, what do I need right now? And I don't believe that that's selfish. I believe it means that like I can be a more functional human being, which is better for me and better for the people that I'm in relationships with and the people that I serve is, yeah, just being mindful of how I can support myself and then support other people around me. I actually kind of came down this pathway toward paganism through, I believe she is a Christian still, but she very much is like an open-minded, let's look to the earth for God's wisdom person. And that is Mary DeYoung. Mary DeYoung is a Seattle-based eco-theologian, and I went to seminary with her. And she is just like an incredibly brilliant teacher. And she does a combo of Celtic spirituality and Christianity and kind of Northwest, just kind of rooted in her own ecosystem and watershed teaching. But the Celts, if you're familiar, they practiced Druidism way back when the Romans brought Christianity to the British Isles and colonized the Celts in that area. There's this strong Celtic traditions of adopting Christianity into their Druidism and melding the two together, that it wasn't taken as like, oh, we have to completely throw out everything. We'll just blend the two. So there's a lot of crossover between like St. Bridget and the Virgin Mary, for example, like a lot of crossover and like a very like muddled, like, wait, who is this person? They're like, who knows? Mother of Christ, maybe. And so Mary teaches a lot from that tradition of like in pre-literate societies, if you wanted to learn about God, you would look at the trees or the stream or commune with the animals around you. And so she really introduced me to that, like, oh, well, seek the divine and seek spirituality in nature and in the changing of the seasons and the phases of the moon. And so that was kind of my entree into, pursuing those things as I said, for me, being a witch is tapping into my own intuition, but I support that with spiritual practices like pausing at the new moon and the full moon for meditation or reflection or gathering with other people. And now that I have Wild Maven Wellness, I do that much more consistently than I ever did before because I facilitate groups on the new moon and the full moon, and I facilitate practices that other people can join me in. I pause at the beginning of each season to reflect, to notice the changes. And also, now that I work for myself, I really try to build my work rhythms and marketing practices and things like that around the seasons. Like I have the most energy in the fall. So that's when I do a lot of like my program development is in the fall when I have that creative energy. I don't expect that of myself in the winter when it's time to like be dormant and quiet and just rest and dream.
Yeah, that's cool. So you're finding your own kind of happiness and looking to nature almost as a church versus a building with external authority and that sort of thing. What kind of transformations have you seen in people that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think just like kind of a general like loosening and unclenching. I work primarily with women and a lot of people who grew up in pretty rigid religious environments and are just kind of looking for ways to be like, well, I know I don't want that. Like, I don't want to have to read my Bible. I don't want to have to go to church. I don't want somebody else to tell me what to do. But like, I kind of am not sure now what to do. And so part of that is like whether I'm working with people one on one for spiritual counseling or in group sessions that I do, like my moon circles, or I'm actually launching in January, like cohort model of a group of folks that are going to work together for the full like calendar year of 2026. But it's kind of figuring out like, well, what seasons do you feel most alive in? Are there certain elements that you feel most connected to? Like, are you a tree person or a water person? And all that to say too, like, those are things that really fit when you want to have like a nature-based spirituality, which I find that a lot of people are really interested in right now. But a lot of people also do find that like within the walls of organized religion. And I'm open to that as well. I'm not going to steer anyone away, but I will always start with like, well, let's tap into your intuition and what actually feels good to you, whether that's like paying attention to sensations in your body, paying attention to your self-talk, paying attention to like what feels like a should versus what feels like it truly calls to you or like really sings to you. And we'll start from there. And if it is being called towards something more structured, then great. Then like go take meditation classes or join the Buddha Sangha and like go meditate with other people. Or if that's too much structure with you, then like we'll find a sit spot like in your neighborhood and or a tree that you'll befriend. So there's a wide spectrum of what will work for folks or actually speaks to them spiritually. But I find, especially working with women, which is not like something that I'm not saying specifically that I only work with women. It's just that seems to be who's most drawn to me is like kind of ex-Christian women, which I'm happy for. But what I find is that a lot of us don't even know kind of like the sound of our own inner voice or the sound of our desire. And so it's really about learning what that sounds like so that we can actually listen to it and then be discerning about what we want from there. I did some pretty intensive work with a therapist a number of years ago before I left Seattle, and I would get so frustrated with her for like the whole first year, I think. And she'd be like, what are you feeling? And I'd be like, I don't know. Like I have like fine, angry, or sad. Like you pick. I don't know. Like I'm crying. Why are you asking me? Crying means sad, I think. Now I'm frustrated. And so I was like just kind of having to grow in my own sense of like even just knowing how I feel. And after many years of like disregarding how I felt because I thought that's what it meant to like be a good person or be a good servant. It's just a lot of relearning that. And then once you can hear it, what do you want to do with it? Like, where does it want to take you?
Yeah. I think that's an important thing to listen to because a lot of people get so caught up with just obeying and following authority and doing things to please that they don't even really take time to listen to their own bodies and themselves. And I think that being intuitive is very powerful. And there's also a lot of people, I believe, who their own intuitions, they conflate that with the voice of God and they project that out as God when really it's just their intuition. But I think it is good to, listen to what you really want and follow that because that's ultimately what's going to make you happy, not trying to please other people.
Yeah. And the challenge, and I think it's a lifelong journey, is then teasing out like what's intuition and what's ego.
Mm-hmm.
And, going through a lot of different spiritual traditions. I think Buddhism in particular, I have found to be helpful for this, is like experiencing ego deaths, which can come in all different kinds of forms. But I essentially just kind of like, you really wanted something, you did your very best and it didn't happen, and you lost a relationship or a job or an opportunity or a hope or something like that. And that can be really life-changing. But I'm grateful for my experience of the dark night of the soul because it changed my life for the better. I mean, that is like, if I can point to one thing that's like the big watershed moment of my life, of like before and after, it's the dark night of the soul. And I'm so grateful for that because of the trajectory that it put me on. But also because then when I work with other people who have these spiritual crises of like, I did everything that I was supposed to do and I got burned instead of getting all the things that I was promised of having like a good life or an easy life. And I can relate to that. And I'm glad that I can be there with people when they go through that. There's this, it's a really old reference now because it's from the West Wing, but it's still like one of my favorite shows of all time, where Josh is like going through just a really hard time with some like PTSD stuff that he's experiencing. And Leo comes to him, and Leo's like been in recovery for a long time. He's sober. And he is helping Josh out. And Josh is like, you're not going to fire me for, fucking so much stuff up. And Leo's like, no, no, no. Just like, imagine there's this guy in a hole and a doctor comes by and the guy's like, save me from this hole. And the doctor like writes a prescription and drops it in and is like, there you go. That should fix it. And then goes on its way. And then like a minister comes by and they write a prayer and drop it in. And they're like, there you go. Just pray this prayer and you'll be good. And then a friend comes along and they jump down into the hole. The guy in the hole is like, you idiot. Now we're both stuck down here. And the friend says like, no, no, I've been down here before and I know the way out. So let me walk with you.
Nice.
And that to me is like, yeah, that's exactly it. Like that's, I think, hopefully what we're all called to do for the people that we love is kind of take them by the hand and say, I have an idea of maybe what you're feeling. And even if I don't, I'm here with you.
Yeah.
And that's cool that you had the dark night of the soul moment. You've had all this, reflection, and you've learned all this information, and now you're helping other people and you're sort of paying it forward in a way. You're out there helping people, and it's great to see. I'm curious just now how your parents feel about who you are now and the work that you're doing. And do they worry about your sort of hell or salvation?
Yeah, it's interesting. Someone asked me recently if my parents were like fearful for me, and I don't think that they are. I think the word witch makes them feel a little bit queasy just because it feels unknown and strange, but they understand what that means for me, that I'm basically just like a tree hugger and I like to swim in natural bodies of water, and I'm not like trying to like hex anybody. So that's good. So I think that they are both like supportive and curious. And I think they want what's best for me. And they tell me all the time that they think I'm doing really important and good things in the world. And that feels really good to have that affirmation from them, knowing like I don't think it was ever their dream that I would grow up to reject and criticize the faith that they raised me in, and particularly the church. Like, I mean, Christianity, it comes in so many different varieties. Like, sure, it's not all bad. It helps a lot of people. It just isn't for me. The church I grew up in, on the other hand, harmful, actively hurting people, actively hurt me. I know that's not what they wanted. They don't go there anymore. If they did, I think that would be a whole other issue.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think they're just happy that I'm happy. And they say that I live in Baltimore now. I don't know if I mentioned that, but they're in Edmonds in the Seattle area. And yeah, when they come to visit, they ask me about it. And I remember sitting in my backyard at one point, kind of explaining a little bit more about kind of like, it's important for me to be in nature, to tap into my internal sense of wisdom. That feels like a really important correction from where I was told that would lead me astray and lead me to bad, shameful places. So they understand that. And they were just here in September and they were like, you just seem really happy. And I was like, yeah.
That's great.
That's awesome.
And that's what you want to see. You want to see people growing and learning and improving their lives and searching for truth. And that should be applauded. versus like just staying stagnant and not asking questions and just complying and obeying just because that's the way that we've always been told to do it. So that's a healthy sign to see people growing in that regard.
Yeah. And I think, like you hope that parents would want. So a couple of things come to mind when you say that, Jake, is like, one is that I've seen a lot of people, there are certain like theological doors they won't open because they're afraid of what's on the other side, and kind of avoiding that crisis of faith that you were talking about earlier, and like that you would encounter like in any good seminary, any good like interrogation of your faith is terrifying because you might find out something that will make you lose that faith. But I already went through that. And so I'm very like theologically fearless. There's nothing, I mean, I also don't believe in a Christian God. So like that's done.
You have no fear of hell and things like that, like an eternal torment.
Yeah. Even when I was still a Christian, I was like, I already lost everything. Like I already lost everything I thought was true about God was thrown out the window during the dark night. Every faith I had in the church went out the window when I tried to be an advocate, and they essentially, I mean, they didn't tell me to leave, but like I couldn't stay, like it just was a very messy time. And I had a very messy exit. But a lot of people who are like, I actively don't want to know the truth, or I don't want to know the answer to this question because I might lose something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I totally understand that position. And I also think that's a really unfortunate way to live.
Yeah, just the willful ignorance.
Yeah. And we don't do that only with our faith, but also like in relationships. Like, I don't really want to know what my partner thinks or my family member or my friend because like I'm afraid I already know the answer or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Or even learning things that you know and hold to be true, but you have this cognitive dissonance where you're holding these two things and it's causing that internal struggle.
Yeah, that sounds like the purity movement. Like, does God care if I have sex, or does God love me for who I am? Like, which is it?
What would you say to someone in the audience that feels like they're in their own dark night of the soul?
I would say just rest. There's a really interesting book. I actually just was looking at it on my shelf the other day called Deep Survival by Lawrence Gonzalez. I have not read it in a long time, but he talks about how there's a certain age of child, I think it's like 6, if and when they get lost in the woods, they actually have like a hugely like disproportionate survival rate. They're like big enough to withstand some like cold and hunger, unlike really little guys. But I think around age 7, we start to grow in our capacity to kind of like make mental maps. And that's very dangerous when you're lost in the woods. And so a lot of adults or anyone over the age of 7 will say like, oh, well, I think I recognize that landmark, so I'm going to go that way. And we're wrong. Like we're absolutely wrong. And so it ends up just being a lot of like fumbling around. And when you're lost, you should like sit still and wait for help to come to you.
Sometimes doing nothing is better than doing the wrong thing. You can make it worse.
Yes. So my advice is be a 6-year-old, because essentially what I remember Gonzalez saying in this book is their mindset is if I'm hungry, I eat. If I'm tired, I sleep. And that's pretty much it. It's like at that level. And that's all you need. Like you don't have to be like wandering around panicking in the dark. You're not going to find what you're looking for. And I'm terribly sorry if that is like disappointing or frightening to hear. I think that people who have that kind of experience, like you have to do your own certain amount of flailing around and kind of tire yourself out from that spiritually. But eventually you'll get to the point where all you can do is just kind of like sit there and grieve or be dumb or cry.
Letting yourself experience the emotions, the grief and the sadness, and
Yes,
getting it out of your system.
Yeah, absolutely. So just experience the feelings, and like when you're hungry, eat, and when you're tired, sleep, and when you feel like crying, cry. And I believe that it will pass, but I also think that it will be life-changing, I hope, in like a really important way, and I hope a really good way.
and when you feel like speaking out, start a podcast.
That's right.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
For people deconstructing, it's often very messy. And you go through periods where you feel like you've lost your community, your family, maybe even your friends, your support system, you feel like has suddenly been taken out from underneath of you. It's a messy period, but it does get better, and you'll make connections with new people and new things. And it's uncomfortable. It's unfortunate, but it just takes time.
Yeah. And if I can just pitch myself and Wild Maven Wellness. I mean, I'll share links with you all, and that's what I'm here for. And your former guest, Jenny McGrath, she called me one time like the anti-pastor, and I laughed out. She like texted it to me, and I laughed out loud. I was laughing so hard. And I was like, maybe that would be a little much for people. Why don't we call me an unpastor? Like, because I think if we're used to like having that community or having a spiritual leader that you can like, you can sit down with your pastor and receive care. But if that's not where you are anymore because you're not Christian, or even if you're considering whether you want to be Christian or not, and you're afraid your pastor will push you like one way or the other, they're like, no, you need this. You have to be Christian. First of all, you could talk to my old pastor, Renee, who was like, go be free. Or you could talk to me. I mean, that's what I'm here for. And that's what spiritual counseling really is about, helping people unpack spiritual experiences they've had, religious or otherwise, and also start to formulate what could be next. And that you don't have to lose all the good parts of being an active, like spiritual person with practices that feed you and help you feel connected to something larger than yourself. That doesn't have to go away, but I think it ought to grow and change with us. And I have had many very lonely periods of my life where it's been hard to find community. Fortunately, I'm not there now, but I would anticipate that it would come again, like if I leave Baltimore and start fresh somewhere else, that would be, you can't always find your people right away. And that was true for me here. I think I moved here like right at the beginning of the pandemic accidentally. I got here like right before shutdown, and it took a really long time. Yeah. And I left a really strong community in Seattle because I was like, oh, now I feel like really confident. Like I could do anything. I'm going to move across the country. I was like, why did I leave you guys? Like, this sucks. But it was the right thing to do. And now I feel very like full with community, but I would say that's been slow growth over, I've been here for 5.5 years. And I would say probably in the last year and a half has been when I've been feeling much more like held here.
That's great.
So I get it. There's really lonely periods in life, and that's part of it. And what can we learn from that itself?
So on that note, where can listeners find you or work with you or sign up?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find all of my offerings at wildmavenwellness.com. And if you scroll to the bottom, there's a place at the footer to sign up for my newsletter, which is a great way to keep in touch. I'm also on Instagram at wild.mavenwellness, but I don't really like social media that much, so I don't really post. It's usually just like, hey, there's a moon circle coming up, which is local to Baltimore, and I would love to see you if you're in the area. But spiritual counseling, I do virtually, and I see people everywhere. So that information is on my website. I also do curated rituals for people. It's not like a huge part of my practice, but that's on the website too. If you want to mark like a personal milestone, either like with a community group or with your household, or I do weddings and things like that as well. So that's all on there. But the newsletter is a really great way to keep up with different offerings. And I will create practices for my moon circles, and then I post them on my blog, and that's what goes in the newsletter, so that even if you're not here, you could still have that and like, oh, well, Wednesday's the full moon. I'll go out and do this practice somewhere, or grab a friend and do it with them. So I try to make that very accessible to folks.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us. It's been great to learn more about you and hear what you had to say.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Thanks for listening as always. And if Annie's story struck a chord with you, your own dark night, your own rebuilding, let it sit. These conversations are here to remind you that you're not crazy, you're not alone, and there's life on the other side of all of this.
If Annie's words resonated with you, please look her up and reach out to her. And if you're in the middle of deconstructing or trying to figure out who you are, we're right here with you. Thanks for listening. See you next time on Exodus Brothers.